There's something oddly comforting about a story you've technically known your whole life, and yet somehow, when Hollywood gets its hands on it, it feels completely unfamiliar again. That's exactly the strange little space that Jack and the Beanstalk lives in. You walk into it thinking you already understand the rules. Poor boy, magic beans, giant in the clouds. But the movie doesn't just retell it, it stretches it, reshapes it, and in some moments, almost questions why this story keeps getting told in the first place. And before you even get to the film itself, the trailer already tips its hand in a very particular way. Not loudly, not in that over-the-top, this will change cinema forever tone that trailers sometimes fall into. It's quieter than that, more calculated. The first thing you notice in the trailer isn't spectacle, it's atmosphere. It opens on this grounded, almost muted countryside. Mud, wood, wind brushing across empty fields. There's a deliberate slowness there. And I remember thinking, okay, they're not rushing into the fantasy. They're letting you sit in the real world first. That matters. Because if the grounded reality doesn't feel believable, the moment the Beanstalk shoots into the sky, you're already checked out. Then there's Jack himself. And the trailer plays him carefully, not as a hero, not even as someone particularly special. He's awkward in that very human way. You can see it in how he carries himself, how he hesitates before speaking. It's subtle, but it's doing a lot of work. The film wants you to feel like this could be anyone, that the story isn't about destiny, it's about accident, or maybe consequence. And when the beans come into play, the trailer doesn't treat them like some glowing magical artifact with dramatic music swelling behind it. It's quieter than that, almost suspicious, like something you shouldn't trust. And that tone, this slight unease, it lingers. Because even though you know what those beans are supposed to do, the trailer makes you feel like maybe, just maybe, this version isn't going to be so simple. And then the moment hits. The beanstalk doesn't just grow, it erupts. And it's not whimsical. That's the key difference. It's violent. Wood splintering, earth tearing apart, structures collapsing as this massive organic force punches its way into the sky. The scale is overwhelming, but what really stands out is the lack of joy in it. This isn't a magical adventure beginning, it's a disruption. Something unnatural forcing its way into a world that wasn't ready for it. That tonal choice tells you everything about the kind of movie this wants to be. Now, visually, the trailer leans heavily into contrast. Down below, everything is textured, almost tactile. You can feel the dirt, the dampness, the weight of the world. Up above, where the giants live, it shifts into something colder, wider, more alien. The clouds aren't soft and dreamy, they're dense, suffocating. The sky doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like stepping into territory where humans don't belong. And then you finally see the giants. Not fully, not right away. The trailer teases them. Quick cuts, partial glimpses, shadows moving behind fog. And that restraint works, because instead of showing everything, it lets your imagination fill in the gaps. When a giant's hand crashes into frame, or a massive silhouette moves through the mist, it lands harder than if they had just thrown a full CGI reveal at you in the first 30 seconds. There's also something interesting in how the trailer handles the supporting characters. You get flashes of royalty, armor, banners, a sense of political structure, but it never fully leans into that classic kingdom in peril narrative. It's there, but it's not the focus. The emphasis stays personal. Jack isn't trying to save a kingdom, at least not initially. He's reacting, trying to survive something that spiraled out of control. And the pacing of the trailer reflects that shift. It starts slow, almost meditative, then gradually builds into something more frantic. Cuts get quicker, the music grows more urgent. By the end, it's all chaos. People climbing, falling, fighting, running from things far bigger than they can handle. But even in that chaos, there's a strange sense of restraint. It never feels like it's trying to overwhelm you with noise. It's controlled, focused. And I think that's where the trailer really earns its keep. Because it doesn't just promise spectacle, it promises a specific kind of experience. One where fantasy isn't necessarily comforting, where magic doesn't solve problems, it creates them, and where the line between adventure and disaster is thinner than you'd expect. There's also a subtle emotional thread running through it, and it's easy to miss if you're just watching for the big moments. Jack's expressions, those brief, quiet shots where he looks unsure, almost regretful, they suggest that this isn't going to be a clean hero's journey. There's weight to what he's done, even if it was an accident. And the trailer doesn't spell that out. It just lets it sit there, underneath everything else. And that's honestly refreshing, because so many modern trailers feel the need to explain everything, to make sure you understand exactly what you're getting. This one trusts you a little more. It gives you pieces and lets you connect them yourself. By the time it ends, you're not just thinking about giants and beanstalks, you're thinking about scale, about consequences, about what happens when something small, something seemingly harmless, grows into something you can't control anymore. And maybe that's the most interesting thing about it. Not the spectacle, not the fantasy, but the idea that this story, this simple, almost childlike fairy tale, can be reframed as something a little more unsettling, a little more grounded in cause and effect. And sitting there after watching that trailer, I remember thinking, okay, this might not be the version of the story I grew up with. It might be something else entirely. There's something oddly comforting about a story you've technically known your whole life, and yet somehow, when Hollywood gets its hands on it, it feels completely unfamiliar again. That's exactly the strange little space that Jack and the Beanstalk lives in. You walk into it thinking you already understand the rules. Poor boy, magic beans, giant in the clouds. But the movie doesn't just retell it, it stretches it, reshapes it, and in some moments, almost questions why this story keeps getting told in the first place. And before you even get to the film itself, the trailer already tips its hand in a very particular way. Not loudly, not in that over-the-top, this will change cinema forever tone that trailers sometimes fall into. It's quieter than that, more calculated. The first thing you notice in the trailer isn't spectacle, it's atmosphere. It opens on this grounded, almost muted countryside. Mud, wood, wind brushing across empty fields. There's a deliberate slowness there, and I remember thinking, okay, they're not rushing into the fantasy. They're letting you sit in the real world first. That matters. Because if the grounded reality doesn't feel believable, the moment the beanstalk shoots into the sky, you're already checked out. Then there's Jack himself, and the trailer plays him carefully. Not as a hero, not even as someone particularly special. He's awkward in that very human way. You can see it in how he carries himself, how he hesitates before speaking. It's subtle, but it's doing a lot of work. The film wants you to feel like this could be anyone. That the story isn't about destiny, it's about accident, or maybe consequence. And when the beans come into play, the trailer doesn't treat them like some glowing magical artifact with dramatic music swelling behind it. It's quieter than that, almost suspicious, like something you shouldn't trust. And that tone, this slight unease, it lingers. Because even though you know what those beans are supposed to do, the trailer makes you feel like maybe, just maybe, this version isn't going to be so simple. And then the moment hits. The beanstalk doesn't just grow, it erupts. And it's not whimsical, that's the key difference. It's violent. Wood splintering, earth tearing apart, structures collapsing as this massive organic force punches its way into the sky. The scale is overwhelming, but what really stands out is the lack of joy in it. This isn't a magical adventure beginning, it's a disruption. Something unnatural forcing its way into a world that wasn't ready for it. That tonal choice tells you everything about the kind of movie this wants to be. Now visually, the trailer leans heavily into contrast. Down below, everything is textured, almost tactile. You can feel the dirt, the dampness, the weight of the world. Up above, where the giants live, it shifts into something colder, wider, more alien. The clouds aren't soft and dreamy, they're dense, suffocating. The sky doesn't feel like freedom, it feels like stepping into territory where humans don't belong. And then you finally see the giants. Not fully, not right away. The trailer teases them, quick cuts, partial glimpses, shadows moving behind fog. And that restraint works, because instead of showing everything, it lets your imagination fill in the gaps. When a giant's hand crashes into frame or a massive silhouette moves through the mist, it lands harder than if they had just thrown a full CGI reveal at you in the first 30 seconds. There's also something interesting in how the trailer handles the supporting characters. You get flashes of royalty, armor, banners, a sense of political structure, but it never fully leans into that classic kingdom in peril narrative. It's there, but it's not the focus. The emphasis stays personal. Jack isn't trying to save a kingdom, at least not initially. He's reacting, trying to survive something that spiraled out of control. And the pacing of the trailer reflects that shift. It starts slow, almost meditative, then gradually builds into something more frantic. Cuts get quicker, the music grows more urgent. By the end, it's all chaos. People climbing, falling, fighting, running from things far bigger than they can handle. But even in that chaos, there's a strange sense of restraint. It never feels like it's trying to overwhelm you with noise. It's controlled, focused. And I think that's where the trailer really earns its keep. Because it doesn't just promise spectacle, it promises a specific kind of experience. One where fantasy isn't necessarily comforting, where magic doesn't solve problems, it creates them. and where the line between adventure and disaster is thinner than you'd expect. There's also a subtle emotional thread running through it, and it's easy to miss if you're just watching for the big moments. Jack's expressions, those brief, quiet shots where he looks unsure, almost regretful, they suggest that this isn't going to be a clean hero's journey. There's weight to what he's done, even if it was an accident. And the trailer doesn't spell that out. It just lets it sit there, underneath everything else. So when the film actually begins, it doesn't rush to justify that feeling the trailer leaves you with. It leans into it. There's no immediate sense of wonder, no sweeping musical cue telling you this is going to be a magical ride. Instead, it opens in a place that feels worn down, almost tired of itself. The kind of village where people don't expect anything to change anymore. Jack lives right in the middle of that stillness, and the movie takes its time letting you observe him before it asks you to care about him. He's not introduced through some heroic act or clever moment. He's just there, helping where he can, failing more often than he'd like, carrying this quiet frustration that never quite turns into anger. And I think that's important, because it sets up a version of Jack who isn't driven by ambition. He's not chasing adventure. If anything, he's stuck in place. There's this early stretch where the film just breathes with him. You see how small his world is. The routines, the limitations, the way conversations feel like they've been repeated 100 times before. And it's not boring, it's deliberate. It's building a baseline. Because once things start changing, you understand exactly what's being disrupted. The introduction of the beans doesn't come with a sense of destiny either. It feels almost like a mistake the moment it happens. The exchange itself is awkward, slightly tense, like both sides know something isn't quite right, but go through with it anyway. And the person who gives them the beans, there's something off there. Not in an obvious villainous way, but in that subtle, unsettling sense that they understand more than they're saying. Jack doesn't treat the beans like treasure. That's what stands out. He doesn't stare at them in awe or immediately believe they'll solve anything. If anything, he seems unsure why he agreed to take them at all. And that hesitation, it lingers. Back at home, the film slows down again. There's a quietness to the night, a sense that everything is exactly where it should be, right before it isn't. And when the beans finally react, when they hit water and begin to change, the moment is almost understated at first. A slight movement, a shift, something unnatural trying to disguise itself as harmless. But it doesn't stay subtle for long. What follows isn't magical in the way fairy tales usually present it. It's chaotic. The growth of the beanstalk feels invasive, like nature breaking its own rules. The house shakes, the ground splits, wood snaps like it's made of paper. And Jack, he's not in control of any of it. He's reacting, scrambling, trying to understand what's happening as it happens. And there's a brief moment in all that chaos where the film does something really smart. It lets you see the fear before the awe. Because yes, the beanstalk is massive, visually overwhelming, stretching beyond what should be possible. But the immediate emotional response isn't wonder, it's panic. By the time everything settles, the world has literally been torn open. The beanstalk stands there like a scar, something that shouldn't exist but now does, and there's no undoing it. And Jack, standing at the base of it, realizes, without the movie needing to say it outright, that this is on him. That realization doesn't turn him into a hero, it weighs on him. And then the film widens its perspective. Because Jack's story isn't happening in isolation, there's a larger world reacting to this event, and the shift is immediate. Soldiers, officials, people who operate on a completely different level than Jack, they see the beanstalk not as a mistake, but as a problem to solve, or an opportunity to exploit. This is where the film starts layering in its broader tension. You get glimpses of authority figures trying to assess the situation, not fully understanding what they're dealing with, but pretending they do. And there's this underlying arrogance there, this belief that anything, even something as unnatural as this, can be controlled if approached the right way. Jack gets pulled into that orbit almost reluctantly. He's not leading anything. He's not even particularly useful at first. He's just the one person who knows where it started, and that makes him important whether he wants to be or not. And then there's the climb. The decision to go up the beanstalk isn't treated like a heroic mission. It feels like stepping into the unknown because there's no other option. The structure itself is unpredictable, twisting in ways that don't feel stable or safe. Every step upward feels earned, slightly dangerous. The higher they go, the more the world below disappears, replaced by something that doesn't follow familiar rules. What's interesting is how the film handles that transition. It doesn't flip a switch from grounded to fantastical. It blurs the line. The clouds aren't soft or welcoming. They're thick, disorienting, almost suffocating. Visibility drops. Sound changes. It's like entering a space where human senses aren't quite enough to process what's happening. And Jack, he's not leading the group. He's keeping up, barely. Watching others make decisions, questioning them silently, trying to piece together what he's gotten himself into. There's a moment where he looks down, back toward the world he came from, and you can feel that disconnect already forming, like he's crossed a line he can't uncross. When they finally reach the top, the shift is immediate but not comforting. This isn't a magical land waiting to be explored. It feels abandoned at first, too quiet, too still, the kind of silence that suggests something is wrong rather than peaceful. The environment is larger than it should be, scaled in a way that makes humans look insignificant without needing to emphasize it. And then you start to notice the details. Footprints that are too large. Objects that don't belong to any human design. Structures that suggest intelligence, but not familiarity. Everything hints at the presence of something else. Something that hasn't revealed itself yet. The group reacts differently. Some see opportunity. Some feel the danger immediately. Jack falls somewhere in between. He's trying to understand, but there's a growing sense that whatever this place is, it wasn't meant to be found again. And that's when the first real sign of the giants appears. Not a full reveal. Not yet. Just movement in the distance. A sound that doesn't quite match anything they've heard before. The ground shifting slightly under weight that isn't visible. It's subtle, but it changes the energy completely. Because up until this point, the threat has been theoretical. Now it's real. And Jack realizes, probably before anyone else fully admits it, that climbing up here wasn't just a risk, it was an invitation. And the thing about that realization, it doesn't land all at once. It creeps in. Because at first, the group tries to maintain control of the situation. They spread out slightly, start examining what's around them, as if understanding the environment will somehow make it safer. There's this instinct to categorize everything, assign logic to it, turn the unknown into something manageable. But the film doesn't let that illusion hold for long. The first real encounter doesn't arrive with a roar or some dramatic entrance. It's quieter, heavier than that. You hear it before you see it. A low, almost rhythmic impact, like something massive shifting its weight just out of sight. And the camera stays close to the characters, which makes it worse. You're not getting a wide, reassuring view of the threat. You're stuck in the same limited perspective they are. Jack freezes before anyone else does. Not because he's braver, but because he's paying attention in a different way. There's this subtle shift in his expression, something between confusion and dread, like he's connecting dots that the others haven't even noticed yet. And then one of them sees it. Just a glimpse. A shape moving behind the fog, impossibly large, but not fully defined. And that's enough. The tension snaps into place immediately. Conversations stop. Movement becomes cautious, deliberate. The film doesn't need to announce the danger. It's already there, sitting in the silence. When the giant finally steps into view, it's not framed like a spectacle. There's no triumphant reveal, no sense of awe. It's almost invasive, like something that shouldn't be seen this close. The scale hits you first, how wrong it feels, how the proportions don't align with anything human. And then the details come into focus. The texture of the skin, the way it moves, the weight behind every step. It feels real in a way that's slightly uncomfortable. The group reacts exactly how you'd expect. Some panic, some try to stand their ground, others don't even know what to do. But Jack, he doesn't move right away. Not out of courage, but because he's trying to process it. This thing exists because of what he did. That connection, however indirect, locks him in place for just a second too long. And that's when everything breaks. The giant doesn't attack immediately, it observes. That's what makes it unsettling. There's a level of awareness there, something beyond pure instinct. It's looking at them the way you'd look at something unfamiliar, but not necessarily threatening, yet. And that ambiguity is worse than outright aggression. Of course, it doesn't stay that way. Something triggers it, a sudden movement, a sound, maybe just the realization that these small figures don't belong here. And the shift is instant. What was quiet tension becomes chaos. The giant moves faster than something that size should be able to, and the ground itself seems to react with every step. The group scatters. And this is where the film really leans into its physicality. You feel the chase. The instability of the terrain, the difficulty of navigating something built for beings much larger than you. It's not a clean escape. People stumble, get separated, make split-second decisions that don't always work out. Jack doesn't suddenly become capable in this moment. He's still figuring it out as he goes. But there's a shift, not into heroism, but into awareness. He starts paying attention to patterns, to movement, to how the giant reacts. It's instinctive, not calculated, but it's there. At one point, he hesitates again, sees someone fall behind, realizes what's about to happen, and there's this brief internal conflict. You can see it in how he moves, or almost doesn't move. The film doesn't spell it out, but the weight of responsibility is pressing harder now. This isn't just about survival anymore. The escape, when it comes, isn't clean or satisfying. It's messy. They don't outsmart the giant, they get away. Barely. And even then, it doesn't feel like a victory. It feels temporary. Once they regroup, what's left of them, the tone shifts again. Not back to calm, but into something heavier. Reality has set in. This isn't a mission anymore. It's a situation spiraling beyond control. And the people who came up here with confidence, with plans, start to show cracks. Jack sits with that more than anyone else. There's a moment where he looks out across this unfamiliar landscape, and it's not wonder in his eyes. It's regret. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet recognition that this didn't have to happen. Or maybe that he didn't fully understand what happening would mean. And while that internal shift is taking place, the film begins to expand the threat, because it's not just one giant. That idea settles in slowly, through sound, through distant movement, through subtle environmental clues that suggest a larger presence. The realization isn't delivered through dialogue. It builds naturally, piece by piece, until it becomes unavoidable. They're not in a place ruled by a single creature. They're in a world. And that changes everything. The group dynamics start to fracture under that pressure. Decisions become harder. Trust becomes thinner. Some want to push forward, convinced there's something to gain from continuing. Others want to turn back, even if going down the beanstalk now feels just as dangerous as staying. Jack finds himself caught between those perspectives, not because he's indecisive, but because he understands both. He knows they can't stay, but he also knows leaving won't erase what's already been set in motion. There's also this growing tension between control and chaos. The authority figures, those who came up here expecting to manage the situation, start losing their grip. Plans fall apart, assumptions prove wrong, and the film doesn't exaggerate that collapse. It shows it in small ways. Hesitation where there used to be certainty. Arguments that don't get resolved. Orders that aren't followed. And in the middle of that, Jack begins to change. Not into a leader in the traditional sense, but into someone who's paying closer attention than everyone else. He's not trying to dominate the situation. He's trying to understand it. And that subtle difference starts to matter more as things get worse. Because they do get worse. The giants aren't just reacting anymore, they're aware. There's a sense that the presence of humans has been noticed beyond that first encounter. Movements in the distance become more frequent. The environment itself feels less empty, more watchful. And the safety they thought they had, even briefly, starts to disappear. There's a sequence where the group attempts to move through a more confined area, structures that suggest some form of giant habitation. And it's here that the scale becomes almost overwhelming. Doors too large to comprehend, objects that serve purposes the humans can't even guess at. It's like walking through the remains of a civilization that was never meant to be understood by something your size. Jack pauses at one point, running his hand along a surface that's clearly been used, shaped, lived in. And there's this quiet realization that these giants aren't just monsters. They have a world, a structure, maybe even a history. And that complicates everything. Because it means this isn't just a survival story anymore. It's an intrusion. And once that idea settles in, that this isn't some empty, hostile wilderness, but a lived-in space that humans have no right to occupy, you can feel the tone shift in a way that's hard to shake off. It's no longer just about getting out alive. It's about understanding the consequences of being here at all, and whether leaving even fixes anything. Down below, meanwhile, the world hasn't been standing still. The film cuts back just long enough to remind you that the beanstalk isn't just a vertical pathway. It's a problem that's still growing roots into everything around it. The kingdom's response becomes more organized, but not necessarily more effective. There's this quiet tension in how leadership handles the situation. On the surface, it's controlled. Orders are given, plans are formed. But underneath that, you can sense uncertainty creeping in. Because how do you prepare for something like this? There are discussions, measured, strategic, about whether to destroy the beanstalk, whether to treat it as a threat or an opportunity. And those conversations feel grounded in a very human kind of logic. Control the unknown, contain it, weaponize it if possible. It's not presented as outright greed or villainy. It's more complicated than that. It's the instinct to manage what can't really be managed. And that contrast between the people below and the group above becomes more pronounced. Down here, everything is about planning. Up there, it's about reacting. Back in the giant's realm, the sense of being watched never really leaves. Even when nothing is happening, there's a tension in the air, like the environment itself is aware of them. The group moves more carefully now, conversations quieter, decisions weighed with more hesitation. And Jack, he's not the same person who climbed up that stalk. There's a growing stillness in him. Not fear exactly, but a kind of focus that wasn't there before. He starts noticing things others miss. Patterns in how the giants move, the spaces they avoid, the rhythms of this world. It's not something he explains, it's something he feels out in real time. At one point, they come across evidence of something that shifts the entire understanding of what's happening here. It's not just that giants exist, it's how they exist. The structure of their world, the way they interact with their environment, even the way they relate to each other, it hints at something more complex than the simple monster label. And that realization doesn't make them less dangerous. If anything, it makes them more unpredictable. Because now you're not dealing with a mindless threat. You're dealing with something that has its own logic, its own rules, its own sense of territory. And the humans are completely outside of that system. There's a moment where the group is forced to hide. Really hide, not just take cover. The kind of stillness where even breathing feels too loud. And in that silence, you hear it again. Multiple sets of footsteps this time. Not one giant, more than one. Moving with purpose. The tension in that scene isn't about action, it's about restraint. Nobody knows what the right move is. Nobody wants to be the one who breaks that fragile stillness. And Jack, pressed against something far too large to comprehend, starts to understand just how small they really are in this place. When the danger passes, if it even fully passes, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like borrowed time. And that's when the fractures within the group really start to widen. Some of them want to leave immediately, consequences be damned. Others argue that they've come too far, that there's something to be gained from staying just a little longer. Information, resources, maybe even control over the giants themselves. That idea, control, keeps coming back, even when it's clearly slipping further out of reach. Jack doesn't align himself cleanly with either side, because he's starting to see the bigger picture in a way that doesn't fit into those simple choices. Leaving doesn't undo what's already been done. Staying doesn't guarantee understanding. And somewhere in the middle of that, he realizes that the real problem isn't just the giants. It's the connection between their world and his. The Beanstalk. It's still there, still growing, still linking two places that were never meant to touch. And as long as it exists, this isn't contained. It's expanding. That idea starts to take hold of him in a way that's hard to ignore. There's a quiet scene where he looks back toward the direction of the stalk, not seeing it directly, but knowing it's there, and you can almost track the thought forming. Not fully shaped yet, not something he's ready to say out loud, but it's there. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about responsibility, and that's a heavy shift for someone who, not long ago, could barely decide what direction his own life was going in. The film doesn't rush that transformation. It lets it build slowly, through small choices, small observations. Moments where Jack steps forward instead of holding back, where he speaks up instead of staying silent. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but consistently. And around him, things keep getting more unstable. The giant's presence becomes more active. Not constant attacks, but a growing sense that they're adapting, learning. The humans are no longer just intruders, they're a problem to be dealt with. And the environment starts to reflect that shift. Paths that once seemed open become dangerous. Areas that felt empty now carry signs of movement. There's a sequence where the group tries to retrace their steps, aiming to head back toward the Beanstalk, and it becomes clear that the journey down won't be any easier than the climb up. If anything, it's worse. Because now they're not just exploring, they're being tracked. And that realization changes how they move, how they think, how they trust each other. Jack takes on a more active role here, not because he's suddenly confident, but because he's paying attention in a way that others aren't. He starts guiding decisions, not forcefully, but through suggestion, through observation. And slowly, almost without anyone explicitly acknowledging it, people start listening to him. Not all of them, not immediately, but enough that it matters. There's still resistance, still doubt, but there's also a growing recognition that the old ways of thinking, the assumptions they brought up here, aren't working anymore. And as they get closer to the Beanstalk, the tension tightens instead of easing, because going back means bringing something with them. Not physically maybe, but the connection doesn't just disappear. And Jack knows that, even if he hasn't fully figured out what to do about it yet. And it's right there, somewhere between the idea of going back and the reality of what back even means anymore, that the story stops feeling like a contained adventure and starts brushing up against something bigger. Something that doesn't neatly resolve just because you make it down alive. Because the Beanstalk isn't just a path, it's a bridge. And bridges don't belong to one side. Down below, the situation has evolved into something far more tense than anyone anticipated. What started as confusion has turned into urgency. You can see it in the way people move, in how quickly decisions are being made now. There's less debate, more action, but not necessarily more clarity. The presence of the beanstalk has become impossible to ignore, not just physically, but symbolically. It's towering over everything, casting this long shadow that feels less like wonder and more like a reminder that something unnatural has taken root. And the discussions around it have shifted. It's no longer just about studying it or containing it. There's talk, quiet at first, then more direct, about eliminating it entirely, cutting it down, destroying the connection before whatever exists above decides to come down. That fear, it's not irrational anymore, because signs have started to appear. Subtle disturbances, things that suggest the giants aren't confined to their world as neatly as everyone hoped. Maybe they haven't fully crossed over yet, but the possibility is there now, and that's enough to change everything. Back above, the group finally reaches a point where the beanstalk comes back into view, and it's almost surreal. After everything they've experienced, seeing it again should feel like relief, but it doesn't. It feels complicated, because it's not just an escape route, it's the source of all of this. Jack stands there longer than anyone else, looking up at where it disappears into the clouds, and then down toward the world he came from. And for the first time, you can see the full weight of the situation settle on him. Not in a dramatic, speech-heavy way, but in the stillness, the hesitation. Others move quickly. They want out. They start preparing to descend, urgency overriding caution. And for a moment, it looks like that's how this ends. Messy, incomplete, but survivable. Except the film doesn't let it be that simple. Because just as they begin that descent, the presence of the giants becomes undeniable in a way it hasn't been before. Not distant, not implied, immediate. There's movement across the landscape, multiple figures now, converging, responding to something. The energy shifts from quiet tension to impending collision. And suddenly, the beanstalk isn't just an escape, it's a target. Jack realizes it before it's said out loud. If the giants reach it, this doesn't stay contained. That understanding hits hard, and you can see the conflict play out in real time. Leave now, save yourselves, hope the problem doesn't follow, or do something about it, knowing full well that doing something might not end well. And what's interesting is that the film doesn't present that choice as heroic. It presents it as necessary. Jack steps back from the edge, not dramatically, not with some big declaration, but with a kind of quiet certainty that feels earned. He's not the same person who climbed up here, not because he's braver, but because he understands the cost now. Others don't immediately agree. There's tension, arguments that don't fully resolve. Some still want to go, some hesitate, and that split feels real. Not everyone is ready to take on a responsibility they never asked for. But the moment doesn't wait for consensus. The giants are getting closer. And the film leans into that urgency without losing its grounded tone. There's no overblown spectacle here, just the growing realization that time has run out. What follows is less about action and more about decision. Jack begins to act, not impulsively, but with intention. The plan, if you can even call it that, isn't perfect. It's built on limited understanding, on instinct more than certainty. But it's something. And for the first time, people start following him not because they have to, but because they believe he sees something they don't. The descent becomes secondary. The focus shifts to the beanstalk itself, how it can be stopped, what it would take to sever that connection. And the film treats that idea with the weight it deserves. This isn't just cutting down a plant. It's undoing a link between two worlds, with consequences that aren't fully understood. There's a moment, brief, almost quiet in the middle of everything, where Jack pauses again, hand resting against the surface of the stalk. And it mirrors that earlier moment when he first encountered the beans. The difference now is awareness. He knows what this is, and he knows what it's done. The approaching giants don't slow down. If anything, they feel more deliberate now, like they understand exactly what's at stake. And that awareness adds a layer of tension that goes beyond simple survival. It's no longer just predator and prey, it's opposing forces trying to control the same point of connection. The film doesn't rush through this. It lets the pressure build, lets the characters sit in the consequences of their choices, even as events push them forward. And Jack, at the center of it, doesn't look like a hero. He looks like someone who finally understands the weight of a decision, and chooses to carry it anyway. And when you sit with that image for a second, Jack standing there, not larger than life, not framed like some mythic figure, but just a guy who made a mistake and is now trying to fix it. You start to realize how deliberately the film has avoided turning this into something clean or triumphant. Because what happens next isn't framed as victory, it's framed as consequence catching up. The tension peaks in a way that feels earned rather than engineered. The giants closing in aren't just obstacles, they're the natural result of everything that's been set in motion. There's no villain speech, no clear line separating right and wrong. Just movement, urgency, and a narrowing window to act. The plan to bring down the Beanstalk, if you can even call it a plan at this point, relies on timing more than precision. There's an understanding, unspoken but clear, that once this starts, there's no halfway. Either the connection breaks, or it doesn't. And that uncertainty hangs over everything. Jack isn't barking orders. He's not suddenly transformed into a commanding presence. Instead, he's focused in a way that feels grounded, watching, listening, adjusting. It's the kind of leadership that doesn't announce itself. It just happens because someone has to make sense of what's going on. Around him, the others move with varying degrees of confidence. Some commit fully, others hesitate even as they act. That hesitation matters. You can feel it in the pacing, in those split seconds where someone almost stops, almost questions whether this is the right move. But there's no time to resolve those doubts. The giants are close enough now that their presence isn't just visual, it's physical. The ground reacts to them, the air seems to carry their movement. And for the first time, you get a clearer sense of their coordination. They're not just reacting blindly, there's intent there, direction, which makes the situation even more fragile. Because if they understand what the Beanstalk represents, then they understand what Jack is trying to do. There's a brief clash, not a full battle, not something choreographed for spectacle, but a collision of forces trying to occupy the same space at the same time. It's messy, disorienting. People scatter, regroup, lose sight of each other. The scale difference makes everything feel slightly out of sync, like the humans are always half a step behind what's happening. And Jack, caught in the middle of that, doesn't overpower anything. He navigates it. That's the key distinction. He moves through the chaos, not above it. There's a moment where he stumbles, actually stumbles, and it's left in. No clean recovery, no heroic save. Just a quick, instinctive adjustment to keep going. It grounds the entire sequence in a way that makes it more intense, not less. As the effort to bring down the Beanstalk reaches its breaking point, the film slows just enough to let you feel what's at stake. Not in a grand, world-ending sense, but in a very immediate, personal way. This isn't about saving everything. It's about stopping something that's already gone too far. Jack's final decision in that moment doesn't come with a speech. There's no declaration of purpose. It's a look, a breath, a shift in posture. And then he acts. What follows is abrupt, not rushed, but decisive. The Beanstalk, something that's felt permanent for most of the film, suddenly becomes unstable. The same force that made it feel unstoppable now works against it. You see the strain, the fractures forming, the structure beginning to give in ways that don't look graceful or controlled. And there's a strange mix of relief and dread in that, because while bringing it down might solve one problem, it creates another. The descent isn't orderly. It's not even entirely visible. It's chaos on a different scale, vertical instead of horizontal. And the film doesn't try to make it pretty. It lets it be what it would actually be. Dangerous, unpredictable, and far bigger than anyone involved. Jack's focus in those moments isn't on the spectacle. It's on survival, yes, but also on making sure the outcome sticks. That this doesn't just delay the problem, that it ends it, or at least contains it. When the collapse finally reaches the ground, there's no immediate sense of triumph, just aftermath. Dust, silence, people trying to process what just happened. Down below, the impact is felt before it's fully understood. The towering presence that had dominated the landscape is gone, or at least no longer what it was, and there's this collective pause as everyone recalibrates. Did it work? That question lingers longer than you'd expect, because the film doesn't rush to answer it. Instead, it sits with the uncertainty, with the idea that even if the physical connection is broken, the consequences of its existence don't just disappear. There's damage. There are questions that don't have clear answers. And there's the lingering possibility that not everything stayed where it was supposed to. Jack, back on the ground, doesn't look relieved in the way you might expect. There's no celebration, no moment of recognition, just a quiet, almost exhausted awareness of what's been done, and more importantly, what it cost. The people around him react in different ways. Some see it as a victory, others as a close call, a few as something that should never have happened in the first place. And all of those reactions feel valid. The film doesn't push you toward one interpretation. It just lets the moment exist. Jack's arc by this point feels complete in a very specific way. Not because he's become something grand, but because he's changed how he sees the world. The smallness that defined him at the beginning isn't gone, but it's been reframed. He understands now that even small actions can have massive consequences. And that awareness, it stays with him. The final beats of the story don't try to wrap everything up neatly. There's no sweeping resolution, no definitive statement that everything is back to normal, because it isn't. Something happened here, something that shifted the boundary between what's known and what isn't. And even if that boundary has been reinforced, it's no longer invisible. Jack stands there at the end, not as a hero in the traditional sense, but as someone who's seen beyond the edges of his world and come back with the knowledge that those edges aren't as solid as they once seemed. And the film lets that idea linger, just long enough to make you wonder whether the story really ends there, or if it just stops at a point where the characters can finally catch their breath. What makes the timing of Jack and the Beanstalk particularly interesting isn't just when it came out, it's the kind of industry moment it quietly slipped into. Because if you think about it, Hollywood has had this long, almost cyclical obsession with reworking classic fairy tales. Every few years, studios circle back to these familiar stories, not out of nostalgia alone, but because they're built on foundations audiences already understand. It's a safer bet, but only if you bring something new to it. And around the period this film arrived, there was a noticeable shift in how those stories were being handled. Earlier adaptations tended to lean heavily into spectacle or outright reinvention, turning simple tales into massive, action-driven fantasies, sometimes losing the core emotional thread along the way. But by the time this version of Jack and the Beanstalk entered the conversation, there was a growing appetite for something slightly more grounded. Not realism in the strict sense, but a tone that treated fantasy with a bit more weight, a bit more consequence. Studios were starting to realize that audiences didn't just want bigger, they wanted more believable stakes. And that's where this film fits in a very specific lane. It doesn't try to outdo everything that came before it in terms of scale. Instead, it adjusts the lens. It takes a story that's often told as a light, almost whimsical adventure and asks, what if this actually happened? Not in a cynical way, but in a way that considers cause and effect, responsibility, and the ripple impact of a single decision. From an industry standpoint, that's a calculated move, because leaning into tone rather than pure spectacle is riskier. It narrows your audience slightly. Families expecting something bright and playful might find it heavier than anticipated, while viewers looking for full-on epic fantasy might feel it holds back. But at the same time, it creates a stronger identity. It gives the film a voice that separates it from the noise. The release window reflects that balancing act. Instead of dropping it into the peak of summer, where it would have to compete with massive franchise blockbusters, the studio positions it in a slot where audiences are more open to mid-scale, story-driven fantasy. That timing matters. It signals confidence, but also awareness. They're not trying to dominate the entire box office. They're aiming for longevity, for steady engagement rather than explosive opening numbers. And that strategy aligns with how the film presents itself. Marketing doesn't oversell it. The trailers, like we talked about earlier, focus on tone and tension rather than overwhelming you with action beats. That approach filters expectations. It attracts viewers who are curious about a different take rather than those just looking for the next big visual event. From a broader perspective, this sits alongside a wave of films that started questioning the formula instead of just following it. You can trace a line through other fantasy adaptations around the same era. Projects that dialed back the excess just enough to let character and atmosphere carry more weight. What's interesting is that this approach often ages better. Spectacle can feel dated as technology evolves, but tone, if handled well, tends to stick. It becomes less about how impressive something looked at the time and more about how it made you feel, how it interpreted a familiar idea in a slightly unfamiliar way. There's also the matter of audience expectation. By the time this film was released, viewers were more media savvy than ever. They'd seen countless reboots, remakes, reimaginings. Simply presenting the same story with better visuals wasn't enough anymore. There needed to be a perspective behind it, a reason for it to exist beyond just recognition. And Jack and the Beanstalk finds that reason in its restraint. It doesn't shout its themes. It doesn't push its message to the front. Instead, it lets the narrative unfold in a way that invites interpretation. The idea of consequence, of unintended outcomes, of small actions leading to massive shifts, it's all there, but it's never forced. That subtlety is a bit of a gamble in a market that often rewards clarity and immediacy, but it also creates a different kind of engagement, the kind where viewers leave the theater thinking about what they just watched, rather than just remembering specific moments. From a production standpoint, you can see the influence of that intent in the choices being made. The visual effects, while important, aren't the sole focus. There's an emphasis on physical environments, on grounding the fantasy in something tangible. Costuming leans toward practicality rather than ornamentation. Even the sound design avoids overstatement, favoring texture over sheer volume. All of those decisions point toward a film that knows exactly what it wants to be, and more importantly, what it doesn't want to be. It's not trying to reinvent the wheel, it's trying to realign it. And in an industry that often chases trends, that kind of quiet confidence stands out more than you'd expect. Of course, that doesn't mean the film exists in a vacuum. It's still part of a system that measures success in numbers, box office returns, streaming performance, audience retention. And within that system, films like this often find their footing, not just in their initial release, but in how they're received over time. Word of mouth plays a bigger role. Viewers who connect with its tone recommend it to others who might be looking for something slightly different. It builds a slower, more organic presence. Not a massive cultural event, but a steady one. And sometimes that's more valuable in the long run, because it means the film isn't just consumed, it's considered. Looking back at its place within the broader landscape, it feels less like a standout anomaly and more like a marker of where certain kinds of storytelling were heading. A point where the industry started experimenting with scale in a different way. Not just bigger or smaller, but more focused. And that focus, it's what allows a story as familiar as Jack and the Beanstalk to feel, even for a moment, like something worth revisiting. When you look at the cast of Jack and the Beanstalk, what stands out isn't just who is playing the roles, but how deliberately the characters are shaped around restraint rather than exaggeration. This isn't one of those adaptations where everyone is pushed into larger-than-life archetypes from the start. Instead, the performances are built on small behaviors, subtle reactions, and that slightly grounded tone the film keeps circling back to. Jack himself is written and performed in a way that avoids the usual chosen one energy. He's not introduced as gifted, destined, or even particularly confident. The actor leans into hesitation, those moments where Jack thinks before speaking, or starts to act and then second guesses himself. It's a performance that feels closer to someone reacting to life rather than controlling it. And that matters, because it sets the emotional baseline for everything that follows. If Jack had been too polished, too naturally heroic, the entire structure of the story would have felt different. Instead, you get someone who feels like he's learning in real time, and the performance supports that uncertainty without making it feel weak. The supporting cast down in the village serves a very specific purpose in that early grounding phase. There's a mentor-like figure, not in a grand wizard sense, but more like someone who has lived long enough to be suspicious of anything that sounds too easy. That skepticism becomes important later because it frames the beans not as opportunity, but as something inherently unstable from the beginning. The actor playing that role doesn't overplay wisdom. It's quieter than that, more observational. Like someone who has seen enough cycles of hope and disappointment to recognize when something doesn't fit the pattern. Then there's the figure who introduces the beans into Jack's life. This is where the casting choice becomes more interesting, because the performance walks a fine line between charm and discomfort. Nothing openly villainous, nothing theatrical, but there's an undercurrent of calculation, the kind that doesn't reveal itself immediately, but sits just beneath the surface of every line. That ambiguity is important, because it keeps the audience from assigning simple labels too early. You're not sure if this is manipulation, coincidence, or something in between, and that uncertainty mirrors Jack's own position in the story. He doesn't fully understand what he's stepping into either. Once the film moves upward into the world of the giants, the cast dynamic shifts dramatically. The human characters suddenly feel small not just in scale, but in performance style. Their grounded acting contrasts heavily with the giants, who are portrayed with a very different physical and vocal presence. The giants themselves are not just monsters in the traditional sense. The actors playing them use a slower, more deliberate rhythm, movements that feel heavy not just because of visual effects, but because of how they're performed. There's a sense of weight in their timing. Even simple gestures feel like they take effort. What's interesting is that the film doesn't make them mindless. The performances suggest awareness, even curiosity at times. That choice shifts them away from pure antagonists and more towards something like an unknown civilization operating on different rules. And that makes the tension more layered, because now the conflict isn't just physical, it's interpretive. Humans and giants aren't just fighting each other, they're struggling to understand what the other even represents. Jack's performance evolves in response to that environment. You can actually track the change in how he moves. Early on, he's reactive, quick glances, uncertain steps, deferred decisions. As the story progresses, those reactions become more intentional. He still isn't dominant in the space, but he starts reading it differently, watching instead of just responding. That shift is subtle, but it's consistent, and it's one of the reasons the character arc feels earned rather than forced. The supporting group that travels with him also reflects different human responses to pressure. Some actors lean into control, characters who try to impose structure on chaos, even when it clearly isn't working. Others collapse into urgency, making decisions quickly without fully processing consequences. That range helps ground the chaos of the giant world, because you always have contrasting emotional responses happening at once. There's a particular strength in how the film avoids turning anyone into a pure archetype. Even the more skeptical or aggressive characters are given moments of doubt. Even the more cautious ones are pushed into action when circumstances demand it. It creates a sense that everyone is improvising, not executing a predefined role. And that improvisational feeling is crucial to the tone, because nothing in this world behaves exactly as expected. One of the more interesting casting dynamics comes from how authority is portrayed in the lower world. The leadership figures aren't caricatures. They're measured, sometimes overly confident, sometimes genuinely uncertain. The actors play them with a kind of institutional weight, people used to making decisions within systems that usually work, until they don't. That contrast becomes more pronounced as the story escalates, because the further the humans get from their familiar environment, the less useful those institutional instincts become. And that's where Jack, oddly enough, starts to stand out. Not because he has authority, but because he lacks it. He isn't bound by the same expectations. His decisions aren't filtered through layers of protocol or political consequence. They're immediate, situational, sometimes imperfect, but increasingly aligned with what the environment actually demands. The giants, meanwhile, are almost the inverse of that. Their presence feels ancient, but not necessarily wise in a human sense. The performances suggest a different kind of logic, one that doesn't prioritize the same things humans do. And that difference is what makes encounters between the two sides so unstable. There's no shared language for intent, only reaction. And across the board, the casting choices support that central idea. This isn't a story about clear heroes and villains. It's a story about scale mismatch, between people, between systems, between expectations and reality. By the time all these performances start colliding in the same space, what you get isn't a traditional ensemble in the blockbuster sense. It's more like overlapping perspectives under pressure. Everyone is reacting to the same situation, but through completely different internal frameworks. And that's what gives the film its texture. Not just the visual scale of giants and beanstalks, but the human scale underneath it all. By the time you strip everything down in Jack and the Beanstalk, what you're really left with isn't just a fantasy structure anymore. It's a chain of decisions that keeps tightening around everyone involved. And the interesting part is how the film lets that play out without ever fully stopping to explain itself. Because the plot, when you lay it out cleanly, is simple. A boy, a mistake, a connection between worlds, and the consequences of that connection. But the way it's experienced on screen feels heavier than that simplicity suggests. The early parts of the story deliberately slow things down so you understand Jack's environment before anything changes. Not just visually, but socially and emotionally too. You get a sense of limitation, economic, personal, even psychological. It's not stated outright, but you feel it in how small his choices are. Everything is within reach, but barely. That matters later, because once the Beanstalk enters the picture, it doesn't feel like an escape. It feels like a rupture. And the film is careful about how that rupture is framed. It doesn't present the magic as inherently good or bad. It just happens. The beans aren't glowing destiny objects. They're closer to a catalyst that nobody fully understands until it's already too late. When the Beanstalk grows, the movie avoids turning it into a triumphant moment. There's scale, yes, but it's not celebratory scale. It's disruptive. The environment reacts like it's being forced open rather than transformed. That distinction is subtle, but it changes how you interpret everything that follows. From there, the story splits into two pressures running in parallel. Down below, there's the human response. Systems trying to interpret something they don't fully understand. Authority figures attempting to classify, control, or neutralize the situation. And up above, there's the unknown world that the Beanstalk connects to, operating under rules that don't align with human assumptions. Jack becomes the bridge between those two pressures, not because he wants to be, but because he's the one tied to the origin point. That responsibility forms slowly. It doesn't hit him in a single emotional moment. It accumulates. One of the most consistent things the plot does is avoid giving him easy clarity. Even when he starts making better decisions, they aren't framed as certainty. They're framed as necessity. He acts because inaction stops being an option. The ascent into the giant world is where the structure of the story really starts to reveal itself. It's not just a change of setting, it's a change of scale logic. Everything becomes slightly misaligned. Distances don't behave the same way. Sound doesn't carry the same way. Even movement feels off, like the environment is calibrated for a different kind of existence. That disorientation is important because it removes the safety net of familiarity. The characters can't rely on instinct anymore. Everything has to be relearned in real time. And that's where tension builds without needing constant action. Because the real threat isn't always what's visible, it's the uncertainty of what isn't understood yet. The giants, when they start appearing more clearly, reinforce that idea. They aren't introduced as a single unified force with a clear agenda. Instead, they feel like a presence that exists within the world, not outside of it. That makes them harder to categorize. Are they defending territory? Are they reacting to intrusion? Are they even aware of humans in the same conceptual way humans are aware of them? The film doesn't rush to answer that, and that restraint is part of what gives the encounters weight. Every time Jack and the group come into contact with that world, the imbalance becomes more obvious. Not just physically, but cognitively. They are interpreting something that doesn't share their frame of reference. And that's where the plot's emotional core starts to form. Because Jack isn't just navigating danger anymore, he's navigating misunderstanding. There's a moment in the middle stretch of the story where that really clicks into place. The characters aren't just trying to survive, they're trying to decide what kind of relationship, if any, can exist between these two worlds. That question isn't answered directly, but it sits underneath everything they do from that point forward. Even decisions that look tactical on the surface, escape routes, timing, confrontation, are actually influenced by that deeper uncertainty. And the film is smart about not over-explaining it. It trusts the audience to feel the shift rather than be told about it. As things escalate, the structure tightens. The beanstalk becomes less of a magical element and more of a pressure point. It's the physical representation of everything unstable in the story. As long as it exists, nothing is truly resolved. That's why the later decisions carry so much weight. They aren't just about immediate survival, they're about whether that connection should continue to exist at all. And Jack, who started as someone reacting to circumstances, gradually becomes the person most aware of that larger implication. Not because he's the strongest or the smartest, but because he's the one who's been closest to both sides of the divide. The ending phase of the plot doesn't try to wrap everything in clean resolution. Instead, it leans into the idea that some actions don't restore balance. They just prevent further imbalance for now. And that's a very different kind of conclusion than traditional fairy tale adaptations usually aim for. It doesn't feel like closure in the classic sense. It feels like containment. And that distinction is really what defines the entire narrative structure of this version of Jack and the Beanstalk. When you step back from Jack and the Beanstalk and actually sit with what it's doing, the interesting thing is how much of the experience is built on restraint rather than escalation. Even the review angle shifts when you start looking at it honestly, not as a spectacle-driven fantasy, but as a story that keeps choosing the quieter interpretation of its own events. Because there are versions of this material that would have gone full spectacle at every turn. The Beanstalk growth as a victory moment, the giants as straightforward villains, the descent as a triumphant escape. But this film keeps pulling away from those instincts, and that choice shapes everything. From a craft perspective, one of the most noticeable things is how the film handles pacing in relation to tension. It doesn't treat tension as something that constantly needs to rise. Instead, it lets it plateau, sit there, almost normalize itself. So instead of constant peaks, you get this uneven rhythm. Build, pause, reassess, build again. That's a harder structure to pull off than it looks, because it requires the audience to stay engaged without being constantly stimulated. And the film manages that by shifting focus away from external action and toward internal recalibration. Characters aren't just reacting to events, they're adjusting their understanding of what those events even mean. That's especially clear in how Jack is written in the back half. He's not suddenly more competent in a traditional sense. He's just more aware. There's a difference. Competence would suggest control. Awareness suggests limitation. And the film is much more interested in limitation. Even the supporting characters reinforce that idea in different ways. Some cling to procedural thinking, plans, structure, hierarchy, despite the fact that the environment they're in doesn't really respect those systems. Others abandon structure entirely and operate on instinct, which is more adaptive but also more chaotic. Neither approach is framed as fully correct. Both are shown as incomplete responses to something larger than either mindset can comfortably handle. That ambiguity carries into the way conflict is staged. Instead of clean battles, you get encounters that feel partially understood. Moments where intention and outcome don't quite line up, where actions are taken with incomplete information and the results ripple out in ways nobody fully predicted. That's where the film's thematic core really sits. Consequence without clarity. You do something, but you don't fully understand what you've done until later, if at all. And that idea extends all the way down to the beanstalk itself. It stops being a magical object and starts functioning more like a narrative fault line, a place where two systems that were never meant to interact suddenly collide. And once that collision happens, there's no clean separation afterward. Even if you remove the physical structure, the implications remain. That's why the later parts of the story feel less like resolution and more like damage control. From a review standpoint, that's also where the film becomes divisive depending on what you expect going in. If you're expecting a traditional fairy tale adaptation with clear moral lines and satisfying closure, this version deliberately withholds that structure. Not out of irony, but out of focus. It's not interested in simplifying its own premise. Instead, it leans into a more modern interpretation of myth, where stories aren't about lessons neatly learned, but about systems interacting in ways that permanently alter both sides. Visually, that philosophy shows up in how the world above the clouds is constructed. It's not designed to be purely enchanting. There's beauty in it, yes, but it's offset by scale distortion and unfamiliar spatial logic. It feels like a place that was never designed with human perception in mind. That alone changes how you read every encounter there. Sound design contributes to that same unease. Silence isn't empty, it's dense. Footsteps don't just echo, they resonate. Even moments of stillness carry weight, like the environment is always holding something just beneath the surface. And Jack moving through that space becomes less about adventure and more about interpretation. He's constantly trying to translate an environment that doesn't want to be translated. By the time the film reaches its final movements, the idea of winning doesn't really apply cleanly anymore. What exists instead is adjustment. The world responds, shifts, recalibrates. And the characters, especially Jack, don't emerge as victors in a traditional sense. They emerge as participants in something that has changed shape because of their involvement. That's a more complicated emotional endpoint, and the film doesn't soften it. It leaves space for discomfort, for uncertainty, for the idea that just because a connection is cut doesn't mean the impact of that connection disappears. And that's probably the most honest thing the film does. It doesn't treat fairy tales as simple moral machines. It treats them like systems that still have consequences long after the story stops being told. By the time everything settles in, Jack and the Beanstalk, the film has already moved past the point where you're expecting neat answers. What it leaves you with instead is a kind of quiet aftermath, less like a conclusion, more like standing in the space after something massive has already fallen. And that's where the final stretch of reflection really starts to matter. Because the film isn't just interested in what happened during the climb, or the encounters above, or even the immediate fallout of bringing the Beanstalk down. It's interested in what remains when the urgency is gone. That's the part most fairy tale adaptations don't really sit with. Once the danger is gone, the story usually wraps itself in resolution. But here, resolution feels like a word the film is deliberately avoiding. Jack's return to the ground doesn't play like a triumphant homecoming. It plays more like re-entry into a world that no longer feels as contained as it once did. The physical structure is back to normal, but perception isn't. There's a subtle disconnect in how he interacts with everything around him. The familiar doesn't feel entirely familiar anymore. That's an important shift because it reframes the entire journey. The story isn't just about going somewhere and coming back. It's about what changes in you when you've seen something that breaks your original assumptions about scale, consequence, and control. The people around him respond in different ways, which quietly reinforces one of the film's underlying ideas. Experience doesn't translate evenly. Some see closure, some see danger narrowly avoided, some see opportunity lost, and some don't fully understand what changed at all. That variation matters. It keeps the ending from solidifying into a single interpretation. Down below, the absence of the Beanstalk is noticeable, but not necessarily comforting, because even though the physical connection is gone, the memory of it lingers. And in a world where something that large once existed, absence doesn't automatically mean safety. It just means the system has shifted into a different state. The film leans into that ambiguity instead of resolving it. There's a quiet sense that what was discovered up there isn't something that can be neatly sealed away in narrative terms. Even if the structure is gone, the knowledge remains. And knowledge, in this story, carries weight. Jack's final moments aren't framed around explanation. He doesn't deliver a summary of lessons learned. He doesn't articulate everything he's come to understand. Instead, what you get is restraint, an acknowledgement that some experiences don't compress easily into language. That's actually one of the more interesting creative choices the film makes. It trusts silence more than dialogue in its final beats. It lets posture, distance, and small gestures carry meaning, instead of wrapping everything in exposition. And that restraint ties back to the way the entire film has been constructed. It's been consistently avoiding over-definition. Even the giants, even the magic, even the rules of the world above, they're never fully explained in a way that flattens them into certainty. They remain partially unknown, which keeps them psychologically present even after the story ends. From a viewer standpoint, that can feel slightly unresolved, especially if you're used to fairy tale adaptations that aim for emotional closure. But thematically, it's consistent. The film has been building toward the idea that not everything introduced into a system can be neatly resolved within it, and Jack himself becomes the living example of that idea. He doesn't return as someone who has been fixed by his journey. He returns as someone who has been altered by exposure to something larger than his original frame of understanding. That alteration doesn't erase who he was, it adds to it, in a way that's not entirely comfortable or easily categorized. That's where the emotional weight of the ending really sits. Not in victory or defeat, but in adjustment. In the realization that certain experiences expand your sense of the world without offering a clean way to integrate them. Even the final imagery avoids pushing toward closure. There's space left intentionally open, not as a tease, but as a reflection of the film's core idea that connections between systems leave traces even after they're severed. And in that sense, the story isn't really about a boy climbing a beanstalk anymore. It's about what happens when two incompatible worlds briefly touch, and neither side can fully return to what it was before. And that's probably the part of Jack and the Beanstalk that sticks the longest once everything else fades. The way it refuses to fully reset itself. Because most fairy tale films, especially modern Hollywood ones, are built around that comforting idea that once the conflict is resolved, the world snaps back into place. Order restored, lesson learned, balance regained. But this story keeps quietly resisting that structure, even in how it exits the frame. There's a lingering sense that the world below isn't the same world that existed before the beanstalk. Not because something physical is still there, but because perception has shifted. The characters who experience the upper world don't carry it as a clear memory. They carry it as a kind of expanded awareness. And that kind of awareness doesn't fade just because the threat is gone. What the film does well, almost without drawing attention to it, is treat that change as permanent but subtle. Nobody announces it. Nobody explicitly reacts to it. But you feel it in the way conversations are slightly more careful, in the way decisions are made with a bit more hesitation than before. It's like everyone is subconsciously aware that the world is larger and less predictable than they previously assumed. And Jack sits right at the center of that shift, without ever fully stepping into a traditional hero returned home role. He's changed, but not in a way that resolves into confidence or authority. It's more like perspective layered over uncertainty. He knows more now, but that knowledge doesn't simplify anything. If anything, it complicates how he looks at everything he once thought was stable. That's a very different kind of character ending than what audiences are usually conditioned to expect from adaptations like this. There's no coronation moment, no symbolic reward, no final declaration of destiny fulfilled. Instead, there's just continuation, but at a different emotional frequency. Even the world building, when you think back on it, supports that idea. The giants weren't just obstacles. They represented an entire system of existence that didn't map cleanly onto human understanding. And once you've seen that system, even briefly, it changes how you interpret scale itself. Not just physical scale, but conceptual scale. What counts as normal? What counts as threat? What counts as manageable? That kind of shift doesn't reverse cleanly. And the film understands that better than most fantasy adaptations that lean heavily on closure. There's also something interesting about how it treats silence in the aftermath. It doesn't rush to fill the space with explanation or emotional punctuation. It allows distance between characters to exist without immediately resolving it. That space feels intentional, almost like the film is respecting the idea that not every emotional or narrative thread needs to be tied off in order for the story to feel complete. From a filmmaking standpoint, that restraint is doing a lot of quiet, heavy lifting. It reinforces the tone that was established early on. This isn't a story about spectacle as resolution, but about disruption as transformation. And that transformation isn't neat. It doesn't make Jack more traditionally heroic. It doesn't make the world more clearly defined. It just leaves both in a slightly different configuration than before the story began. If you think about it in terms of structure, the film almost behaves like a closed loop that doesn't fully reconnect at the end. It circles back toward its origin point, but not perfectly. There's a slight offset, a reminder that something passed through the system and changed it, even if the surface appears stable again. That's why the ending feels more reflective than conclusive. And in a strange way, that's what gives it staying power. Because instead of walking away with a sense of completion, you walk away with a sense of adjustment. Like the story didn't end, it just stopped speaking at a certain point. Jack's final presence in the film carries that exact feeling. Not resolution, not defeat, not triumph. Just awareness sitting alongside uncertainty. And the film doesn't try to push him beyond that. It lets him exist in that in-between space. And maybe that's the most honest place this kind of story can land, when it stops pretending fairy tales are only about beginnings and endings, and starts acknowledging everything that changes in the middle. There's something about the way Jack and the Beanstalk ends up sitting in your head afterward that doesn't really fade in a clean way. It doesn't behave like one of those films you can neatly file away as good adventure or classic remake or even dark reimagining. It lingers in a more unsettled space, like your brain keeps returning to certain images without fully deciding what they mean in a traditional sense. And honestly, that might be the most honest outcome for a story like this. Because once you strip away the familiar label of a fairy tale, what's left is something closer to a study of scale mismatch, between intention and consequence, between curiosity and control, between what humans think they're stepping into and what they actually end up touching. The Beanstalk itself becomes less of a plot device over time, and more of a metaphor that refuses to simplify itself. It's not just a bridge between two worlds. It's a pressure point that exposes how fragile assumptions really are when they're stretched beyond their intended environment. And that idea doesn't go away when the structure is gone. That's the thing the film keeps quietly insisting on without ever turning it into a speech. Even after the physical connection is severed, the conceptual connection remains. The awareness that there is, or was, something beyond the edge of what was previously understood doesn't disappear. It just settles into memory in a way that isn't fully digestible. And Jack carries that more than anyone else. Not in a loud cinematic transformation kind of way, but in a quieter recalibration. The kind where you can't really return to the version of yourself that existed before certain knowledge entered the picture. There's no dramatic personality shift, just a subtle change in how distance, risk, and decision-making feel. That's a hard thing to visualize in a blockbuster context, and yet the film keeps leaning into it anyway. Because if you think about the structure of the story as a whole, it's not really built around victory conditions. It's built around exposure. Each stage of the narrative exposes the characters to a slightly larger version of reality than they were prepared for. First, it's personal limitation. Then, environmental disruption. Then, scale distortion. Then, an entire ecosystem operating under unfamiliar logic. And at no point does the film fully reverse that exposure. That's why the ending doesn't feel like closure. It feels like containment. Not everything is solved. Not everything is understood. But something has been contained enough to prevent immediate escalation. And that's a very different emotional endpoint than traditional fairy tale storytelling usually aims for. It's also why the tone of reflection matters so much in the final stretch. Because when you remove the urgency, what you're left with is interpretation. People trying to make sense of what they saw, what they experienced, and what it might mean moving forward. And interpretation is never uniform. It fragments. It shifts depending on perspective. Some characters interpret the events as narrowly avoided disaster. Others see them as opportunity interrupted. Others still see them as a warning that hasn't fully revealed its full implications yet. And Jack sits in a different category entirely, somewhere between understanding and uncertainty. He's not trying to define the experience anymore. He's just acknowledging that it happened, and that it matters in ways that don't resolve easily into language. That kind of ending doesn't give you emotional punctuation. It gives you emotional continuation. And that's a subtle but important difference. Because instead of walking away feeling like the story is closed, you walk away feeling like it has shifted into a quieter state of existence. Like it still exists somewhere in the background of thought, just no longer actively unfolding. From a thematic perspective, the film is also doing something interesting with the idea of boundaries. Not just physical boundaries between worlds, but conceptual ones. What is considered knowable? What is considered controllable? What is considered safe to engage with? The Beanstalk breaks those categories temporarily, and even after it's gone, the categories don't return to their original rigidity. They've been loosened, expanded, made slightly less absolute. That's why the film feels more modern in its interpretation than older versions of the same story. It's less interested in moral clarity and more interested in systemic consequence. Less about good versus bad, and more about what happens when systems interact without shared rules. And that's a harder idea to wrap a traditional ending around, which is probably why the ending feels the way it does. Quiet, restrained, slightly open-ended without being incomplete. Even the emotional tone avoids forcing resolution. There's no heavy-handed music telling you how to feel, no final speech summarizing the journey. Just a sense that everyone involved has moved slightly past where they started, but not in a straight line, more like an offset. And that offset is what stays with you, because long after the Beanstalk is gone, the idea of it still exists in how you interpret everything that came before it. The early simplicity of the village, the decision to take something that seemed insignificant, the moment of growth that changed scale entirely, the realization that not everything above or below follows the same logic. It all recontextualizes itself once you understand where it leads. And that's where the film earns its final impression. Not through spectacle, not through resolution, but through lingering recalibration. It doesn't ask you to remember a hero's journey. It asks you to remember what it felt like when the journey stopped behaving like a story you already knew. At this point, the conversation around Jack and the Beanstalk naturally shifts away from plot and into something a little more reflective. Almost like you're asking what the film does to you after you've already processed what it shows you. Because there's a difference between watching a fantasy story and sitting with one. And this one, even in how it's constructed, seems more interested in the second experience. What stands out most in hindsight isn't any single sequence or visual set piece, but the way the film keeps refusing to let any moment become purely self-contained. Every major event, whether it's the growth of the Beanstalk, the first encounter with the giants, or the collapse of that connection later, feeds forward into something else. Nothing is allowed to fully exist in isolation. That's why the film feels more like a chain reaction than a traditional narrative arc. And that structure quietly changes how you engage with it as a viewer. Instead of waiting for big moments, you start paying attention to consequences. Instead of anticipating spectacle, you start tracking cause and effect. That shift in attention is subtle, but it's what makes the experience feel more grounded than most fairy tale adaptations, even though the subject matter is anything but grounded. There's also a kind of emotional discipline in how the film handles its characters, especially Jack. It never overinflates his importance, even when the story logically positions him at the center of events. He remains reactive more often than not, shaped by what's happening rather than shaping it through dominance or certainty. And that matters because it keeps the story from slipping into myth-building territory. Instead of becoming the chosen one, Jack becomes something more relatable and less stable. Someone who makes a decision without fully understanding its scale, and then spends the rest of the narrative dealing with what that decision unlocked. That's a more modern kind of storytelling logic, and it fits the tone the film is building toward. Even the world of the giants, when you think back on it, doesn't behave like a traditional fantasy kingdom. It's not designed for easy comprehension. It doesn't map cleanly onto human expectations of structure or purpose. It feels operational rather than symbolic, like a system that exists independently of human interpretation. And that creates a persistent sense of imbalance throughout the film. Because every time humans try to interpret that world through familiar frameworks, danger, territory, conflict, survival, it resists those labels just enough to remind you that those labels might not be sufficient. That resistance is part of what gives the film its lingering discomfort. Not fear exactly, more like interpretive instability. You're never fully sure you've categorized what you saw correctly, and that uncertainty doesn't resolve when the story ends. If anything, it becomes the final takeaway. From a storytelling perspective, that's a risky approach. It doesn't offer the emotional closure audiences are often trained to expect. There's no final reaffirmation that the world is safe again. There's only the implication that something once opened has now been closed, but not erased. And that distinction is important, because closure suggests finality. Containment suggests ongoing awareness. The film chooses containment. That choice also reframes how you think about the earlier parts of the story. The village at the beginning doesn't just represent simplicity, it represents limited perception. The Beanstalk doesn't just represent adventure, It represents forced expansion of that perception. And the world above doesn't just represent danger, it represents scale that resists human categorization. Once you see that pattern, the entire narrative becomes less about events and more about transitions in understanding. And Jack, at the center of it, becomes less of a hero and more of a conduit for those transitions. He moves between states of understanding without ever fully stabilizing in one. And that's probably the most honest reflection of what the story is actually about. Not transformation into something greater, but exposure to something larger. Even the final tone of the film supports that reading. There's no dramatic emotional punctuation marking the end. Instead, there's a kind of soft disengagement from escalation. The world doesn't reset, it just stops escalating. And that's a very different feeling to walk away with, because it means the story doesn't really end in the traditional sense. It ends in a reduced intensity of consequence. And that reduction is where the reflection begins. So when you think back on it later, not immediately, but after some distance, you don't remember it as a simple fairy tale retelling. You remember it as a story about what happens when scale breaks alignment, and how people adjust when they realize the world is larger, stranger, and less neatly structured than they assumed at the beginning. And that realization, once it settles in, doesn't really fade. At a certain point with Jack and the Beanstalk, you start to notice something a little unusual for this kind of material. It doesn't really invite you to finish thinking about it. Most fairy tale adaptations, even the darker ones, eventually guide you back toward emotional closure. They give you a final moral shape to hold on to. But this one keeps slipping out of that structure the longer you sit with it. Even in memory, it behaves less like a finished story and more like a scenario that's still echoing in different directions. And that's largely because of how it handles consequence. The film never isolates consequence as a single moment. It spreads it out. It starts with something as simple as a decision that doesn't feel particularly significant at the time, and then slowly shows how that decision expands into systems, reactions, and responses that no one fully controls anymore. By the time you reach the later stages of the story, you're not looking at individual choices. You're looking at layers of reactions stacked on top of each other. That's what gives the whole narrative its uneasy weight. Because nothing is ever fully contained in the emotional sense, even when it is physically contained in the plot. Jack's journey, in that context, stops being about heroism entirely and becomes more about awareness under pressure. He's constantly forced to operate slightly ahead of his own understanding. He sees effects before he fully understands causes, and by the time he catches up, something else has already shifted again. That creates a kind of narrative instability that the film never really resolves, and doesn't seem interested in resolving. Even the world above the Beanstalk, when you revisit it in your mind, doesn't behave like a typical fantasy realm. It doesn't offer clear geography in the emotional sense. It doesn't give you landmarks that feel safe or stable. It feels more like an environment defined by scale rather than meaning, which is part of why it leaves such a strong impression without relying on traditional lore building. And that's an interesting creative decision, because it places emphasis on perception rather than explanation. You're not meant to fully understand that world. You're meant to experience how it feels to not understand it. That difference is subtle, but it changes the entire tone of the film. Back in the human world, the absence of the Beanstalk doesn't function like resolution. It functions more like suppression. Something enormous was present, and now it isn't, but the awareness that it existed doesn't disappear with it. That creates a strange psychological residue in the story's aftermath. People don't talk about it in a way that suggests closure. They talk around it, as if direct language would make it more real again. That kind of storytelling choice is doing a lot more work than it appears to on the surface. It shifts the film from a what happened narrative into a what remains narrative. And what remains, in this case, is uncertainty. Not the dramatic kind, the quieter kind. The kind that sits underneath normal life and slightly alters how decisions are made without announcing itself. Jack embodies that shift more than anyone else. He doesn't return as someone defined by the journey in a traditional sense. He returns as someone who has had his assumptions stretched and doesn't fully snap back into place afterward. There's no sense of completion in his arc, just adjustment. And that adjustment is ongoing, even when the story is no longer actively unfolding. That's why the film lingers differently than expected. It doesn't rely on memorable set pieces alone, although those exist. It relies on the afterimage of those set pieces, the way they reframe earlier simplicity once you understand where they lead. The village at the beginning feels different once you've seen the scale above it. The decision to take the beans feels different once you understand what it unlocked. Even silence feels different once you've experienced how much larger silence can become in a world that isn't designed around human presence. And that layering effect is what gives the film its lasting texture. It's not trying to overwrite the fairy tale you already know. It's trying to complicate your relationship with it just enough that you can't return to it in the same way again. And once that shift happens, it doesn't really reverse. It just stays there, quietly reshaping how you remember the story long after it's over. When you reach the final stretch of thinking about Jack and the Beanstalk, what becomes clear is that the film isn't really interested in giving you a final answer to anything it sets up. It's more interested in leaving you with a structure of questions that don't neatly collapse into resolution. And that's why, even after all the plot points are mentally organized, there's still a sense that something about it is unfinished in a very intentional way. Not unfinished in the sense of missing pieces, but unfinished in the sense that the story refuses to close the interpretive loop for you. That's a big distinction, because most stories guide you toward a conclusion that emotionally stabilizes everything that came before it. This one doesn't stabilize, it recalibrates. It changes how you interpret earlier events without locking that interpretation into a single fixed meaning. So even the early simplicity of Jack's world starts to feel different once you've seen how far that simplicity stretches. The Beanstalk doesn't just represent a magical escalation, it becomes a structural disruption to everything that came before it. And that disruption doesn't get undone in a clean narrative sense, it just stops expanding. That stopping point is what the film leans on. And it's subtle, but it changes the emotional math of the entire story. Because if you think about it carefully, nothing really returns to its original state. The world doesn't reset, the characters don't revert. Even the sense of scale doesn't go back to what it was before. It just becomes less visible again. That's very different from resolution, and Jack's final position in all of this reflects that difference more than anything else. He isn't elevated into myth, and he isn't returned to anonymity either. He exists in a middle space, someone who has seen something that expands his understanding but doesn't provide him with a framework to fully integrate it. That kind of character state is rare in traditional fairy tale adaptations, which usually prefer clearer endpoints. But here, the ambiguity is the point. Even the way the film frames consequence reinforces that. Consequence isn't treated as punishment or reward, it's treated as persistence. Actions continue to exist in the world even after the immediate situation is over. The Beanstalk may be gone physically, but the conditions that allowed it to exist, and the reactions it triggered, don't simply disappear. They linger in perception, in memory, in the way people recalibrate what they consider possible. That's why the ending feels less like closure and more like adjustment to a new baseline. And that's also why the film stays with you longer than expected. Because it's not trying to deliver a final emotional statement that wraps everything up. It's trying to leave you in a slightly altered interpretive state, where the story continues to echo even without active progression. Jack's journey, viewed through that lens, becomes less about transformation into a defined role, and more about exposure to a larger system that doesn't fully translate into human terms. And once that exposure happens, it doesn't get erased. It just becomes part of how he perceives everything afterward. That's the quiet weight the film carries. Not spectacle, not even conflict in the traditional sense. But the idea that once your understanding of scale changes, it doesn't comfortably shrink back down. And that's where the story ultimately settles. Not in conclusion, but in expanded awareness that doesn't fully resolve itself into closure.